Daniel Whitmore grabbed his wife's wrist in front of 60 guests and whispered through his teeth, "Stop embarrassing me and smile." Emily looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at the woman standing beside him, the woman he had walked in with, whose perfume was still in the air, whose hand he had been holding 30 seconds ago. And she smiled. Not the smile Daniel wanted. The smile of a woman who had just made a decision she would never take back. If someone has ever made you feel worthless after you gave them everything, this story was made for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Emily's story travels. Emily Carter was not the kind of woman who asked for much. That was something people who knew her always said, and they meant it as a compliment. She was steady. She was reasonable. She was the kind of person you called when things fell apart, because somehow, no matter how bad the situation was, Emily always found a way to hold it together. She had been that way her entire life. Growing up in a small town in western Massachusetts, the daughter of a retired civil engineer and a high school librarian, Emily had learned early that the world didn't reward people who complained. It rewarded people who showed up, figured things out, and kept moving. Her father used to tell her, "Emily, anybody can fall apart. The question is, who gets back up?" She had carried those words like a second spine all the way through college, through her MBA at Boston University, through the early years of her career in corporate finance, and eventually into the complicated and beautiful disaster of her marriage to Daniel Whitmore. She met Daniel at a fundraiser when she was 27 years old. He was charming in a way that felt specific and intentional, not like a performance, but like a man who had simply grown comfortable with his own ability to make people feel at ease. He was funny, he was direct. He had a habit of leaning in when he listened, like what you were saying was the most important thing anyone had said all week, and somehow that made even the most ordinary conversations feel significant. Emily fell in love with that version of Daniel. She genuinely did. And in the early years that version of him showed up consistently enough that she believed it was real. They married 3 years after they met. A small ceremony by Daniel's parents' standards, which meant 70 people in a private garden outside Boston with a string quartet and a dinner that cost more than Emily's first car. But Emily didn't care about the details. She cared about the man standing at the end of that garden, watching her walk toward him with something that looked unmistakably like awe on his face. She thought that day that she had chosen correctly. For a while she had. The first 5 years of their marriage were genuinely good. Daniel was building the Whitmore Corporation into something real, taking the family's real estate business and expanding it into private equity, strategic investment, commercial development. It was ambitious work, and Emily threw herself into supporting it with everything she had. Her background in corporate finance made her invaluable in ways that neither of them initially anticipated. She started reviewing contracts, then managing relationships with lenders, then quietly renegotiating terms that Daniel had agreed to without fully understanding the long-term exposure. He noticed. Back then he noticed. He used to come home and say, "You know what my team said today? They said they don't know how I convinced you to marry me instead of starting a competing firm." And he'd laugh and she'd roll her eyes, and there was a warmth in it, a mutual recognition that they were genuinely partners, that they had built something together that neither of them could have built alone. But success has a way of changing people's memory. As the company grew, as Daniel's name started appearing in business publications, as the invitations to exclusive events multiplied, and the social circle expanded, the story of how the Whitmore Corporation succeeded began to shift. Slowly at first. So slowly that Emily barely noticed it happening. Daniel stopped saying "we" at industry dinners. He started saying "I." He stopped introducing Emily as his partner. He started introducing her as his wife with a particular emphasis on the word that somehow managed to make it sound like a category rather than a person. He stopped asking her opinion before he made major decisions and started presenting them to her as things that had already been decided. And Emily, because she was Emily, absorbed all of it quietly. She told herself it was the pressure of rapid growth. She told herself it was the company's culture, that Daniel was surrounded by men who behaved this way, and he was being unconsciously influenced. She told herself that the foundation of what they had was strong enough to survive the surface tensions of ambition and ego. She was wrong about all 3 of those things, but she wouldn't fully understand that for another 4 years. In the meantime, she kept working. Behind the scenes, she had become something that no organizational chart would ever reflect. She was the person who called their primary bank contact on a Saturday morning when their credit facility was about to be frozen due to a covenant violation. Daniel hadn't disclosed to her until the night before. She was the person who flew to New York without announcement to meet with an investor who was threatening to withdraw because he'd heard a rumor accurate. It turned out about a deal that had gone sideways. She was the person who had spent 3 months quietly restructuring the personal guarantees on the company's debt so that a bad quarter wouldn't expose their entire family's financial future. She did all of this without titles, without credit, without most of the time acknowledgement, and she told herself it was enough to know. But it wasn't enough. It never had been. She had simply learned to pretend it was. The first time she understood that something had shifted permanently was a Tuesday evening in October, about 18 months before everything finally broke open. Daniel came home from a meeting with a group of technology entrepreneurs he'd been courting as potential investors, and he was animated in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. He talked for 40 minutes about the ideas that had been exchanged, the vision one particular person had for integrating technology with commercial real estate, the energy in the room, the feeling that he was finally in the company of people who matched his ambition. And then he said something that Emily would turn over in her mind many times afterward. He said, "You know what the difference is between those people and most of the people I deal with? They're not afraid to want more. They're not comfortable. They're hungry." Emily looked at him across the kitchen table and said quietly, "Are you saying I'm too comfortable?" Daniel blinked. "No, I'm not saying that about you specifically. But you're saying it about someone." He didn't answer directly. He changed the subject. And Emily let him because she was tired and because some part of her already knew that pressing the question would only lead somewhere she wasn't ready to go. She thought about that conversation a lot over the following months. She thought about it as Daniel began spending more evenings at industry events she wasn't invited to. She thought about it as his phone became something he carried face down and charged in the study rather than on the nightstand. She thought about it as the quality of his attention, the leaning in she had loved so much when she first met him, gradually redirected itself toward everything and everyone except her. She noticed. Of course she noticed. But Emily Carter had been trained by a lifetime of self-discipline to handle what she noticed by addressing it practically rather than emotionally. She had seen other marriages fracture because one person's fear turned into accusation, turned into a fight that nobody won. She didn't want that. So instead of confronting, she waited. Instead of demanding answers, she watched. And while she watched, she did something else. She started preparing. She had a conversation with Rachel Morgan, her attorney, whom she had known since law school, who was now one of the most respected family and corporate law practitioners in Boston. And she told Rachel that she wanted to review every document she had personally signed in connection with the Whitmore Corporation. Rachel listened carefully, asked a few precise questions, and said, "Emily, how long has this been building?" Emily said, "Long enough that I need to be ready." Rachel nodded. She didn't push for more than that. She simply said, "Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks changed everything. What Rachel uncovered, or more accurately what Emily already knew, and Rachel organized into a form that could not be argued with, was that Emily had, over the course of the past 7 years, provided personal financial guarantees on debt instruments, totaling almost $42 million. She had negotiated directly, or through intermediaries' relationships, with 7 institutional lenders, whose confidence in the Whitmore Corporation rested substantially on their confidence in Emily personally. She had used her own family's professional network, her father's former colleagues, her mother's former student, who was now a senior partner at a regional development firm, to open doors that Daniel had never fully understood were being opened for him specifically because of who Emily was and who trusted her. When Rachel laid all of this out in a 4-page summary document, Emily read it twice and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "So if I walk away?" Rachel said, "If you walk away correctly, yes. The exposure would be significant." Emily nodded slowly. She folded the document and put it in her bag. She thanked Rachel and drove home through Boston in the November dark, and she thought about 12 years and about love and about all the ways a person can be both absolutely necessary and completely invisible at the same time. She didn't decide anything that night, but she stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. The next 6 weeks had a quality of suspension about them, the way the air gets before a serious storm when everything is still and heavy, and you can feel the pressure changing, but the rain hasn't started yet. Emily went to events with Daniel. She hosted a dinner for his investors. She managed a difficult renegotiation with their primary lender that Daniel didn't even know had been necessary until she told him it was already resolved. And she watched him. She watched the way he held his phone at those events. She watched the way he sometimes stepped outside for calls that lasted 20-25 minutes. She watched the particular care he took with certain messages, the way his expression shifted when certain notifications came through. She didn't say anything. She was waiting for the moment when she wouldn't have to. That moment came on the last Friday of January. It came in the form of a charity dinner at the Whitmore family mansion outside Boston, the annual event that Victoria Whitmore Daniel's mother had organized every year for the past 2 decades as a way of cementing the family's social position and demonstrating their generosity to the causes they supported. Emily had helped plan every aspect of this year's event. She had selected the catering company, negotiated the price, approved the guest list, personally called 6 of the major donors to ensure their attendance. She arrived at the mansion at 6:30 in the evening, 20 minutes before the official start time, in a simple black dress she had owned for 3 years and still loved because it made her feel like herself rather than like a costume. She greeted Victoria at the entrance, a cool, practiced exchange of air kisses that said everything about their relationship without either of them having to use words. She circulated through the early arrivals, said the right things to the right people, and was standing near the main entrance with a glass of wine when she heard the doors open behind her. She turned. Daniel walked in with his hand at the small of another woman's back, guiding her into the room like he was presenting something he was proud of. The woman was Olivia Bennett. Emily knew the name. She had encountered it in the way you encounter things you have been half expecting, with a recognition that sits just below surprise, like the answer to a question you already knew the answer to. Olivia Bennett was 31 years old. She had built a social media consulting business that worked primarily with luxury brands and had cultivated in the process a very specific public identity, confident, beautiful, well-connected, comfortable in the rooms that mattered. She was photographed at the right events. She was tagged in posts by people whose names you recognized. She was in the language of the world. Daniel had been increasingly drawn towards someone who matched his ambition. Emily heard him say those words later in the middle of the room to a group of people who had turned to stare. "I want you all to meet Olivia Bennett. She's someone who genuinely understands what I'm building, someone who matches where I'm going." He was looking at his guests when he said it, but everyone in that room understood who the words were directed at. The silence that followed was the kind that happens in social situations when everyone present knows something terrible is occurring and no one has decided yet what the appropriate response is. People looked at Emily, then looked away, then looked at her again. Victoria Whitmore's face went the particular kind of rigid that only happens when a woman of her background is fighting to maintain composure in a situation she had not authorized. And Emily stood very still. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She had imagined this moment, not exactly this, but something like it many times over the past several months. She had imagined anger. She had imagined humiliation. She had imagined a desperate, shameful urge to fight for something she already knew was gone. What she actually felt was clarity. It was almost physical, a kind of settling, like when a building finds its foundation. Every question she had spent months refusing to ask directly had just been answered in front of 70 people, by the man who had once watched her walk toward him with something that looked unmistakably like awe on his face. She set her wineglass down on the nearest table. She reached into her evening bag. She retrieved her wedding ring. She had taken it off in the car on the way here, because she had known somehow that this was what tonight was, and she placed it carefully on the table next to the wineglass. The room watched. Daniel's expression shifted. Something between confusion and performance, a kind of theatrical uncertainty, like an actor who has suddenly discovered the audience is larger than expected. He said, "Emily, don't make a scene." And Emily looked at him. At this man, she had loved this man, she had carried this man who was standing in a room full of people holding another woman's hand and telling her not to make a scene. And she said in a voice that was completely, absolutely calm, "Then let her build the future you want." She picked up her handbag. She walked to the door. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard Victoria say sharply, "Daniel, fix this, right now." She heard the sound of people beginning to move and speak again, the way a crowd does when the frozen moment finally breaks. She heard Daniel say something she couldn't make out. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, something between frustration and the beginning of fear. She pushed open the front door of the mansion and walked out into the cold January night. The car was where she'd parked it in the curved driveway near the fountain. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Then she opened her handbag. Inside, alongside the ring she had just placed on a table, was a manila folder. Inside the folder was the 4-page document Rachel had prepared, and attached to the back of that document with a paperclip was a single additional page, a letter of intent dated 3 days ago, signed by Emily, notifying all relevant parties of her intention to withdraw her personal financial guarantees from the Whitmore Corporation effective 30 days from the date of signature. She had signed it on Tuesday. She had not told Daniel. She had not told Victoria. She had carried it into the mansion tonight, not because she planned to use it as a weapon, but because she had learned over 12 years of managing crises that Daniel never knew were crises, that the most important thing you could do in any dangerous situation was know exactly what your position was before the situation forced you to find out. She knew her position. She started the car. And as she drove away from the Whitmore family mansion through the dark Massachusetts streets toward the small apartment she had quietly rented 2 weeks ago, under her maiden name, Emily Carter felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself, not Daniel's wife, not the woman behind the successful man, not the invisible foundation of someone else's empire, just herself. The phone in her bag buzzed 3 times before she reached the highway. She didn't look at it. She already knew who was calling. And for the first time in 12 years, she was in no particular hurry to answer. Back at the mansion, Daniel was standing in the middle of the main hall, with Olivia's hand no longer in his, because Olivia had stepped back the moment she understood that the room's attention had shifted from admiration to judgment. Victoria was speaking to him in a low, controlled voice that he recognized as her genuinely furious register, the one she reserved for situations that threatened the family's reputation rather than merely their feelings. She said, "You brought that woman here, to my event, with your wife present. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" Daniel said, "Mother, this is between Emily and me." "It stopped being between Emily and you the moment you walked through my door with your hand on that woman's back," Victoria said. "And now Emily has left her ring on my table in front of 60 guests. So tell me, Daniel, what is your plan?" Daniel didn't have a plan. I had been so certain in the way that people are certain when they've been slowly convincing themselves of something for long enough that it starts to feel like truth, that Emily would react the way she always reacted. She would be hurt. She would be angry. There would be a difficult conversation. But ultimately, she would want to preserve what they had built. She would want to protect the life they shared. He had not imagined the ring on the table. He had not imagined that absolute, unarguing calm. He had not imagined the door. He called her 4 times on the drive back to their house. She didn't answer. He texted twice. Nothing. He sat in the living room of the house they had shared for 8 years and waited for her to come home. And the hours moved slowly, and she didn't come home. And by 2 in the morning, he had begun to understand that something had changed in a way he did not yet know how to measure. He would spend the next several days trying to measure it. And what he would discover piece by piece would be the education of his life. The apartment Emily had rented was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Boston, 3 blocks from Rachel Morgan's office. It was small, a 1-bedroom with a galley kitchen and a living room that faced the street, and it was almost completely empty when Emily arrived that first night because she had furnished it minimally and deliberately. A bed, a desk, a chair by the window, a coffee maker. She sat in the chair by the window for a long time after she arrived, not sleeping, not crying, just sitting in the quiet and letting herself exist inside it. She thought about love. She thought about what it actually meant. Not the version of it that showed up in the kind of movies Victoria Whitmore would have approved of, where love was demonstrated through grand gestures and sacrifice, and the willingness to absorb whatever was done to you because the connection itself was worth the pain. But the actual thing, the daily, unglamorous, honest thing. She had loved Daniel. She was almost certain she had loved him well, and specifically not just the idea of him, but the actual person, his sense of humor, his ambition, his ability in the early years, to make her feel like what she said and thought genuinely mattered to someone. But at some point, and she sat with this for a long time, trying to locate exactly when she had crossed a line that she hadn't recognized as a line when she crossed it. She had stopped loving Daniel and started managing him, started protecting the investment, started treating the marriage the way she treated the company's most sensitive financial positions, something that required constant maintenance and strategic intervention and the suppression of her own honest assessment, because the alternative was a crisis she didn't want to handle. She had done this, she understood now, because she was good at it, because managing things was her strongest skill and her deepest habit, because the alternative, stepping back and letting Daniel face the consequences of who he actually was and what he was actually doing, felt to her like failure. But whose failure? She sat with that question in the chair by the window until the city outside began to lighten toward dawn. Then she got up, made coffee, opened her laptop, and wrote Rachel a message that said only, "I'm ready, let's begin." Rachel replied at 6:15 in the morning, because Rachel Morgan was that kind of attorney. "I'll have everything ready by 9. Come in when you're able." Emily arrived at Rachel's office at 8:45. She was carrying the folder, and she was completely, absolutely calm, because the woman who had spent 12 years holding everything together for someone else had finally decided to start with herself. Daniel Whitmore did not sleep that night. He sat in the living room of the house he and Emily had shared for 8 years on a couch she had picked out under a lamp she had chosen, staring at a phone that kept showing him her name going to voicemail. He called 6 times. He texted 4. He even at some point around midnight wrote a message that started with the word please and then deleted it, because Daniel Whitmore was not a man who said please easily, especially not to someone he had decided was overreacting. That was how he had framed it in those early hours. Overreacting. Emily was emotional. She had seen something that looked worse than it was. She would calm down overnight. She would come home in the morning, and they would have the conversation. He had been preparing himself for the one where he explained carefully and reasonably that things had changed between them, that he needed something different, and that they could handle this like adults. He had the whole speech organized in his head. What he did not have was Emily. By 7 in the morning, he had driven past her mother's house in Newton, dark, quiet, no car in the driveway. He had called her closest friend Margaret twice, and Margaret had picked up the second time and said in a voice that was not warm, "Daniel, I genuinely don't know where she is, but I'll tell you this, wherever she is, she doesn't want to hear from you right now." And then she hung up. He sat outside her mother's dark house for a few minutes and tried to understand what he was feeling. It was not guilt. Not yet. It was something closer to disorientation, the feeling of a man who had been moving very fast in a very clear direction and had suddenly discovered that the road had ended somewhere he didn't recognize. He drove back home. He called his mother. Victoria Whitmore answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake and waiting, which meant the situation was already worse than he wanted to admit. She said, "Tell me you've spoken to her." He said, "She's not answering." There was a silence on the other end of the line that Daniel had known since childhood. It was the silence his mother used when she was deciding exactly how much of what she actually thought she was going to say out loud. Then she said, "Daniel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you did last night was not simply a personal matter between you and your wife. You walked into my event, which Emily helped organize with another woman on your arm. You made an announcement. You humiliated Emily in front of 60 people, many of whom are investors, donors, and professional contacts of this family. And then she left her ring on my table and walked out, and now she's not answering your calls. Does any part of you understand what is actually happening right now?" Daniel said, "Mother Olivia and I." "I don't want to hear about Olivia," Victoria said, and her voice had gone very flat. "I want you to find your wife. And I want you to understand that Emily is not simply your wife. She is the reason 3 of our largest lending relationships are still intact. She is the reason the Meridian deal closed last spring. She is the reason that when the Callaway situation nearly destroyed us 2 years ago, we survived it. You may not have been paying attention to that, but I have been. Find her, Daniel. Today." The line went dead. Daniel sat with his phone in his hand and felt the first genuine flicker of something that was not disorientation. It felt like the beginning of fear. He called his chief financial officer, a methodical man named Arthur Reeves, and asked him in what he hoped was a casual tone whether there were any outstanding matters that required Emily's personal attention or authorization. Arthur was quiet for a moment that was just slightly too long. Then he said, "Actually, Daniel, yes. There are a few things I've been meaning to bring to you. Can we meet this morning?" They met at 9:30. Arthur closed the office door, which he almost never did, and set a folder on the table between them and began to explain in the precise and careful language of a man who has been trained never to cause unnecessary alarm that several of the company's most significant debt instruments carried personal guarantee provisions that were currently held by Emily. Daniel said, "Right, yes, we've discussed this before." Arthur said, "What I'm not sure you fully appreciate, Daniel, is the degree to which some of our institutional relationships are, and I'm trying to be precise here, contingent. The confidence those lenders have in our creditworthiness is partially, in some cases, substantially relational, meaning it's tied to specific people and their personal financial credibility. And Emily is," he paused, chose his next words carefully, "Emily is someone those people trust in a way that is not easily transferred." Daniel looked at him. "What are you saying?" Arthur said. "I'm saying that if Emily formally withdrew her personal guarantees, and if certain of those relationships perceived that as a signal about the company's internal stability, we would have a significant problem, not immediately, but within weeks possibly." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She wouldn't do that." Arthur looked at him with the expression of a man who had worked with Emily Carter for 6 years and had a somewhat different assessment of what she would and wouldn't do. He said, "I hope you're right." Daniel went home and called Olivia. She answered on the first ring, and her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, slightly careful, slightly measuring. She said, "How are you doing? How did things go after I left?" Daniel said, "I need a few days to manage some things on my end. I'll call you when I can." There was a brief silence. Then Olivia said, "Of course, take whatever time you need." She said it easily, smoothly, in the tone of someone who was not rattled. And somehow that bothered Daniel in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. He had expected her to be concerned, to ask questions, to want to know what was happening. Instead, she just said, "Take your time," and hung up. He sat with that for a moment, and then pushed it aside, because there were more immediate things to manage. He drove to Rachel Morgan's office. He knew Emily and Rachel were close. He had always been slightly uncomfortable with that closeness in the way that people are uncomfortable with alliances they don't fully understand. Rachel was sharp in a way that made him feel in her presence slightly outpaced. She had a habit of listening to what you said and then responding to something you hadn't quite said, some implication or assumption beneath the surface of your words, and it always made Daniel feel like he was operating with less information than she had. He walked into her office without an appointment, which the receptionist told him was not possible, and he said he would wait, and he sat in the waiting area for 35 minutes until Rachel came out herself. She looked at him with an expression that was professionally neutral and said, "Daniel, I can give you 10 minutes." He followed her into her office, and she did not sit down, which he understood was intentional. She stood behind her desk with her hands folded and waited. He said, "I need to talk to Emily." Rachel said, "I can't help you with that." He said, "Is she okay?" Rachel said, "Emily is my client. I can tell you that she is safe. Beyond that, I'm not in a position to share anything with you." He said, "Rachel, whatever she's told you, whatever she's thinking about doing, I need you to understand that there are people whose livelihoods depend on the company's stability. Employees, families. This isn't just about Emily and me." Rachel looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel, I've known Emily for 15 years. In that time, I have watched her save your company from 3 separate crises that you were not fully aware were crises until she had already resolved them. I have watched her use her own professional reputation, her own personal relationships, and her own financial credibility to protect something that bore your name but ran on her judgment. And I watched what happened last night because 2 people who were there called me this morning to tell me about it." She paused. "So when you come into my office and tell me to think about the employees, I want you to understand that Emily has been thinking about the employees and the lenders and the investors and the long-term health of that company for years. What she is doing now is thinking about herself. And I have to tell you, Daniel, it is long overdue." The 10 minutes were up. He walked out of Rachel's office and stood on the sidewalk outside and felt the fear that had been flickering since early morning settle into something more concrete and specific. He needed to find Emily, not to apologize. He hadn't reached that point yet, but to contain the situation, to explain, to ensure that whatever she was feeling didn't translate into decisions that couldn't be undone. He drove to their house and sat in the kitchen and thought about what Victoria had said about the Meridian deal and the Callaway situation. He had known in a general way that Emily had been involved in those things. He had known she was smart and capable and useful. What he had not done, what he understood now, with the particular sharpness of a man who has just had something taken away, was understand the specific and irreplaceable nature of what she had contributed. He had treated her contributions the way you treat the foundation of a building. You know it's there. You walk over it every day. You do not generally think about it, until it shifts. His phone rang. It was Arthur again. Arthur said, "Daniel, I've just received a certified letter. I need you to come in." The letter had arrived at the company's registered address that morning. It was from Rachel Morgan's office on behalf of Emily Carter Whitmore. It formally notified the company, its lenders, and all relevant counterparties of Emily's intention to withdraw her personal financial guarantees, effective 30 days from the date of the letter. The date on the letter was 3 days ago. She had signed it before the dinner. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he set it down on Arthur's desk and said nothing for a long moment. Arthur said very carefully, "She signed this on Tuesday, before the event." Daniel said, "Yes." Arthur said, "So she knew. Going into that dinner she already knew." Daniel said, "Yes." Arthur said, "Daniel, we need to call the board." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. That gave Daniel the weekend 48 hours to reach Emily, to reason with her, to find some way to pull back from the edge of whatever this was becoming. He tried everything he could think of. He sent flowers to the address he eventually found through a mutual acquaintance, a downtown apartment building he hadn't known existed. The flowers were returned uncollected. He wrote a letter by hand, 3 pages, in which he said things he had not said out loud in years, things about how much she meant to him, and how he had made a terrible mistake, and how he wanted to fix it. He had it delivered by courier. He did not hear back. On Sunday afternoon, his mother appeared at the house. Victoria Whitmore walked in without knocking, sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her son with an expression that was not soft. She said, "Have you spoken to her?" He said, "No." She said, "Have you tried?" He said, "I've tried everything. She won't respond." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. She said, "Good." He looked at her. "What?" She said, "I said good. If she's not responding to you, it means she's thinking clearly. And Emily, thinking clearly is the only thing that might save this company, because you have clearly stopped doing so." She sat back and looked at him steadily. "I want to tell you something, Daniel. I want to tell you something I should have told you several years ago, and I didn't, because I thought you were figuring it out on your own, and I was wrong about that." He said nothing. She said, "Emily is the best thing that ever happened to this family. Not this company, this family. I have watched that woman absorb things that would have broken other people and keep moving and keep building and keep protecting something that was only partially hers to protect. And I watched you walk into my home on Friday night with another woman and introduce her to our guests as someone who matched your ambition." She stopped. "Your father would be ashamed of you." Daniel looked at the table. His mother said, "The board meeting is Monday. Emily will likely be there because Rachel will have told her she needs to be. When you see her, you will not perform. You will not manage. You will not say the things you think you're supposed to say to make the situation easier. Do you understand me?" He said, "What am I supposed to say?" Victoria said, "The truth, for possibly the first time in several years." She left shortly after. Daniel sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, and then somewhere in the quiet of that Sunday evening, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but something. He started thinking, really thinking, not strategically, but honestly, about the past several years, about the decisions he had made and the justifications he had used, about the story he had been telling himself, which was that he was a man of vision and ambition, who needed to be surrounded by people who matched that, who understood that, who didn't hold him back with the weight of routine and compromise. He had told himself that Emily had become comfortable, that she had stopped growing, that what he needed was someone who sparked something in him that had gone quiet. But sitting in that kitchen on a Sunday night with a certified letter on the table and a company in crisis, and a mother who had just told him his father would have been ashamed, he started to wonder whether the thing that had gone quiet was not his ambition, whether it was his gratitude. He picked up his phone. I did not call Olivia. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time, and then he put it face down on the table and thought about 12 years. About a woman who had flown to New York without telling him because she was handling a crisis he didn't know was a crisis. About a woman who had spent a Saturday morning on the phone with their bank so that he could spend that Saturday morning at a golf event that had been important to him. About a woman who had watched him take credit for things she had built again and again and again and had said nothing and kept going and kept building. He thought about what Victoria had said, the best thing that ever happened to this family, and he thought about Olivia, who had said, "Take your time," and hung up without asking a single question. He was starting to understand the difference. But understanding the difference and knowing what to do with that understanding were two very different things, and he was not yet sure he had earned the right to bridge that gap. Monday morning arrived with the weight of something that cannot be put off any longer. Daniel drove to the office earlier than usual. The board members arrived between 8 and 8:30. Arthur had prepared materials. The company's primary legal counsel was present. There were 7 people in the room when Daniel walked in, and all 7 of them had the expression of people who were worried and trying not to show how worried they were. Daniel sat at the head of the table. He looked at the door. At 8:55, the door opened. Rachel Morgan walked in first, carrying a leather portfolio that she set on the table without ceremony. She took a seat on the left side of the room and opened the portfolio and looked at no one in particular. And then Emily walked in. Daniel had not seen her since Friday night. 3 days. It felt much longer than that. She was wearing a dark navy suit he had seen before, and she had her hair pulled back, and she was carrying a single leather folder, and she moved across the room with the calm and directness of someone who had spent the weekend not crying but preparing. She took a seat across from Rachel and set her folder on the table and looked up. Her eyes met Daniel's for exactly 2 seconds, and then she looked away toward the board members and said, "Good morning. I appreciate everyone making time on short notice. I'll try to be brief." One of the board members, a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had known the Whitmore family for 20 years, cleared his throat and said, "Emily, before we begin, I want to say on behalf of the board that we value your relationship with this company enormously, and we hope that whatever personal matters are," Emily said pleasantly and without any sharpness. "Gerald, I'd rather we focus on the business. Is that all right?" He nodded immediately. She opened her folder. What followed was 45 minutes that Daniel Whitmore would remember for the rest of his life. Emily walked the board through the structure of her personal guarantees, clearly, methodically, without emotion, but also without cruelty. She explained which lenders carried relationship-dependent provisions. She quantified the exposure. She outlined the timeline created by the 30-day notice she had already sent. And then she stopped. She said, "I want to be clear about something. I am not doing this to damage this company. There are people who work here who have nothing to do with what happened Friday night, and I am not interested in hurting them. What I am interested in is a conversation about what the company's governance structure actually reflects, and whether the people who have contributed to its success are being appropriately recognized and protected." Gerald said, "What are you proposing, Emily?" She said, "I'm proposing several things. Independent oversight of financial decisions, a restructured leadership arrangement, and an honest accounting of the company's history, who built what, who protected what, and who should have authority over what going forward." The room was very quiet. Daniel said, and his voice came out differently than he intended, less controlled, more raw, "Emily." She looked at him. He said, "I need to say something." She waited. He said, "Everything you just described, everything you showed this board, I knew it. Not the details, maybe, but I knew. I knew what you were doing. I knew what it meant. And He stopped, started again. "I stopped saying thank you, and then I stopped noticing. And then I started telling myself a story where I was the one who had built everything, and you were just there, in the background. And I knew it wasn't true. Some part of me knew it the whole time." The room was absolutely still. He said, "What I did on Friday night was not a mistake. A mistake is something you do by accident. I did that on purpose. I wanted to, I don't even know, prove something about who I was, about the direction I was going." His voice was unsteady now. And what I proved was that I was willing to humiliate the person who made everything I have possible in front of 60 people, because I needed an audience for my own. I don't even have a word for it. Arrogance, cowardice, both. Emily was watching him. Her expression had not changed dramatically, but something in her eyes had shifted a slight opening the way a window moves when there's a change in the air pressure outside. She said carefully, "Daniel, what you're saying matters. But I need you to understand that I am not here today because of what happened Friday. I am here because of what happened over the last 4 years. Friday was just when I finally stopped pretending I hadn't noticed." He nodded. She said, "I need to know that this company's decisions will be made transparently going forward, that the people who contribute will be recognized, that there is accountability." Gerald said, "Emily, I think I speak for the board when I say that we are prepared to discuss a formal restructuring of leadership and governance, with your ongoing involvement if you're willing." Emily looked at him. Then she looked at Rachel, who gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. She said, "I'm willing to discuss it." The meeting continued for another hour, outside the conference room in the hallway. During a brief recess, Daniel found himself standing near the window, and Olivia texted him for the first time in 3 days. The message said, "Have you figured things out yet? I have an event this weekend and I thought maybe we could—" He stared at the message for a long time. Then he put his phone in his pocket without responding. He stood by the window and watched the city below and thought about what Emily had said. Not just the formal statements about governance and accountability. The other thing, Friday was just when I finally stopped pretending I hadn't noticed. He thought about how long she had been noticing. I thought about all the years of her noticing and staying anyway. Not because she was weak. He understood that now with a clarity that felt almost physical. Not because she was weak, because she had been choosing every day to believe in something that he had been quietly dismantling without fully understanding what he was destroying. Rachel Morgan came out of the conference room and walked past him toward the elevator. She stopped when she reached him. She said, "For what it's worth, and I'm only saying this because I have known Emily for a very long time and I know what she actually wants. Underneath all of this, she did not come here today to hurt you. She came here because she needed to know that she could stand in a room and tell the truth about what she contributed and have people hear it. That's what she needed, not revenge, just to be seen." Daniel said, "Do you think is there any possibility that she and I—" Rachel looked at him with the expression of a person choosing their words with great care. She said, "Daniel, right now the most important thing you can do has nothing to do with Emily. It has to do with you. Whether you're actually going to change or whether you're going to learn to say the right things until the pressure is off and then go back to the same patterns." She paused. "Emily has seen both versions of what people do under pressure. She'll know which one you are. She always does." She got on the elevator. The doors closed. Daniel stood in the hallway alone, back inside the conference room. Emily was reviewing documents with Gerald and Arthur, calm and methodical, the way she always was when she was doing work that she was genuinely good at. She was not thinking about Daniel standing in the hallway. She was thinking about the document in front of her and about the question Gerald had just asked about restructuring the oversight committee and about whether the timeline she had proposed was realistic given the lenders' positions. She was doing what she had always done, holding things together. But this time, she was holding together something that was hers. When the meeting finally ended just past noon, Emily collected her folder and thanked the board members individually and walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button and waited. The doors opened. Daniel was standing on the other side. He had clearly been waiting. She stepped in. The doors closed. They rode down in silence for 2 floors. Then Daniel said, "I'm not going to ask you to come back. I know I don't have the right to ask that." Emily said nothing. He said, I want you to know that I heard what you said, not just in the meeting. What you said about Friday being when you stopped pretending. I've been thinking about how long you were pretending, and I don't have a word for what I am. I don't think sorry covers it." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Emily stepped out. She walked 3 steps toward the building's exit, and then she stopped. She turned around. She looked at him, really looked at him the way she hadn't allowed herself to do since Friday night, and she said, "Daniel, I spent 12 years loving you and 6 of them carrying you. What I need right now is not your regret. What I need is to find out who I am when I'm not doing either one of those things." She pushed through the door and walked out into the city. Daniel stood in the lobby and watched her go. and for the first time in a very long time he did not reach for his phone. He just stood there and let the understanding of what he had lost settle into him slowly, the way cold settles into a room when the heat goes off. Outside, Emily walked half a block before she stopped on the sidewalk and took a long, slow breath. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. But she kept walking, because that was what she had always done. And this time, finally, she was walking towards something that was entirely her own. Part 3. The woman they thought would break. 3 weeks had passed since the board meeting. 3 weeks since Emily had walked out of that elevator and into the cold Boston air and kept moving. 3 weeks since she had told Daniel clearly and without drama that what she needed was to find out who she was when she was not loving him or carrying him. 3 weeks during which the Whitmore Corporation had been operating under a kind of suspended tension. Everyone showing up, everyone doing their jobs, but with the particular careful energy of people walking through a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. Emily felt none of that tension in her own apartment. She woke every morning at 6, made coffee in the small galley kitchen, and sat at the desk by the window for an hour before she did anything else. She was not journaling. She was not meditating in the way that self-help books described meditation. She was simply sitting with herself, getting reacquainted with the person who had been so busy managing everyone else's crises that she had forgotten what her own thoughts sounded like when nobody needed anything from her. They sounded, she discovered, considerably more interesting than she remembered. She had started something during those 3 weeks. Something small at first, a set of notes in a plain notebook about a conversation she'd had with a woman named Diane at a neighborhood coffee shop. Diane was 44 years old, had run a small floral design business for 9 years, and was trying to figure out how to expand without losing the quality that had made her business worth expanding. They had talked for 2 hours over coffee that Emily had intended to drink alone, and by the end of it, Emily had filled 6 pages of the notebook with ideas she hadn't been asked for and couldn't stop generating. She thought about that conversation for 2 days afterward. She thought about how it felt to use her mind in that specific way, not to protect something that was already built, not to manage a crisis that someone else had created, but to help someone build something from the beginning. How it felt to have all of her attention directed toward a problem that was genuinely interesting instead of merely urgent. She called Rachel on a Thursday morning and said, "I want to talk to you about something that isn't the Whitmore situation." Rachel said, "Thank God. Come for lunch." Over lunch, Emily laid out something she had been turning over for years without letting herself fully examine it. She wanted to create a fund not large, not institutional, not the kind of thing that required a team of 20 people and a glossy prospectus. Something direct, a program that would connect women who had the financial expertise and professional credibility that Emily had spent her career developing with women like Diane, who had the talent and the drive and the ideas but not the access, not just capital. Access. The thing that had opened doors for Daniel for years was not money. It was relationships. Emily had those relationships. She had built them herself carefully over more than a decade. She wanted to use them for something that was hers. Rachel listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" Emily said, "Honestly, about 4 years." Rachel said, "And you didn't start it because," Emily said, "because I was busy keeping Daniel's company from falling apart." Rachel picked up her fork and pointed it at Emily and said, "Then I think it's time." They talked for 3 hours. By the end of lunch, Emily had the outline of something real. But the world outside her apartment and Rachel's office was not standing still while Emily rebuilt herself. Daniel had been trying. She could see the evidence of it indirectly in the way the Whitmore Corporation's internal restructuring was moving forward with a speed and sincerity that she had not expected. Gerald Forsythe had called her twice in the past 2 weeks to update her on the board's progress. A new oversight committee revised governance protocols, a formal review of compensation structures that had long been overdue. The changes were real. They were not cosmetic. She had also heard from Arthur, who told her in his careful way that Daniel had personally called 3 of their most important lenders and spoken to them directly about the company's transition. Not to spin, not to manage perception, actually to explain what had happened and what was being done about it. 2 of the 3 calls had gone well. The third lender, a man named Preston, who had always dealt primarily with Emily, had listened to Daniel's explanation and then said quietly, With respect, Daniel, I'd like to hear from Emily before I make any decisions about our ongoing relationship. Arthur had relayed that to Emily with what she suspected was carefully disguised satisfaction. She had called Preston herself, not because Daniel needed her to, because she had a genuine relationship with Preston that predated the current crisis, and she respected him, and she wanted to be honest with him about what the company's situation actually was. Preston listened. Then he said, "Emily, can I ask you something personal?" She said, "You can try." He said, "Are you going to be okay?" She said, "Preston, I'm better than I've been in years." He laughed, and she could hear real relief in it, and he said, "Then I'll stay, but I want the new governance structure in writing before end of month." She said, "You'll have it." What Emily did not tell Preston or Arthur or Gerald or anyone connected to the Whitmore world was that she had also had a conversation that week that had nothing to do with any of them. She had spoken to Olivia Bennett. It had not been planned. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Emily was coming out of a coffee shop near her apartment, and a woman was coming in, and they nearly collided in the doorway, and then they both stopped because they recognized each other, and the moment had a quality of inevitability that neither of them had prepared for. Olivia looked for a fraction of a second like she wanted to keep moving, like the momentum of the situation might carry her through the door and past the moment without requiring her to engage. But Emily had stopped, and Emily was looking at her directly without hostility, but without flinching, and there was something in that steadiness that apparently made avoidance feel impossible. Olivia said, "Emily, I don't know what to say." Emily said, "You don't have to say anything." Olivia said, I want to say I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I need you to know that I didn't. When Daniel and I first started talking, he told me that you and he had already separated, that it was over, that it was just a legal process." Emily looked at her for a moment. She said, "Did you believe him?" Olivia was quiet. Then she said honestly, "I wanted to believe him. And then things moved faster than I expected, and by the time I started asking more questions, it was already complicated." Emily said, "How are things now between you and Daniel?" Olivia laughed, but there was no humor in it. She said, "We haven't spoken in 2 weeks. He's changed. Or he's going back to who he was, I don't know. But the Daniel I've been dealing with lately is not the Daniel I thought I was involved with." She paused. "He was performing, wasn't he, when I met him? He was performing a version of himself that he wanted to be, and I thought it was real." Emily said, "He's very good at performing." Olivia said, "So were you, but yours was the real version." They looked at each other for a moment on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. Two women on opposite sides of a situation that had damaged both of them in different ways. And then Emily said, "Olivia, can I tell you something not as Daniel's wife, just as one person to another?" Olivia said, "Please." Emily said, "Don't spend the next several years of your life figuring out what you're worth through other people's valuations. I made that mistake for a long time. Do the work on your own. You're clearly smart enough to do it." Olivia stared at her. She said, "How are you not angry at me?" Emily said, "I was, for about 48 hours. She paused. "Then I realized that being angry at you was just another way of making this story about Daniel, and I'm done making things about Daniel." She said goodbye and walked back toward her apartment and did not think about the conversation again until that evening when she sat at her desk by the window and realized that the encounter had cost her nothing. No leftover rage, no recycled pain, just a conversation between two people who had both been handled by the same man and were both in their different ways figuring out what came next. She opened her notebook and wrote for 2 hours. Meanwhile, Daniel was having a considerably less settled 3 weeks. The restructuring was taking everything he had. Not because it was technically complicated, the governance changes were straightforward enough once everyone agreed they were necessary, but because of what it required from him personally. Transparency, genuine, specific, documented transparency about decisions he had made and the factors he had or hadn't considered. He had sat in 3 separate meetings with board members and legal counsel and walked through his decision-making process on matters he would previously have handled behind closed doors, and each time he felt the particular discomfort of a man who is used to being believed, discovering what it feels like to be required to show his work. It was, he admitted to his friend Marcus one evening over dinner, humbling in a way he had not anticipated. Marcus, who had known Daniel since college and had the particular license that came from 25 years of friendship, said, "Humbling how? Like good humbling or like painful humbling?" Daniel said, "Both. It's like you know how you can be so focused on a direction that you stop looking at what you're passing on the way. And then something makes you stop and look back and you realize that what you passed was actually the whole point," Marcus said. "Are we talking about the company or Emily?" Daniel said, "I don't know how to separate them anymore." Marcus ate in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something honestly?" Daniel said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Olivia, what was that actually about? Not what you told yourself it was about. What was it actually about?" Daniel put down his fork. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I think I had started to feel like Emily could see too clearly, like she knew exactly who I was and what I was actually doing versus what I was claiming I was doing. And instead of that being a good thing, the way it used to feel early on when I actually wanted someone who saw me clearly, it started to feel like pressure, like judgment. And Olivia she looked at me and saw what I was performing, and she was impressed by the performance, and that felt easier. Marcus said, "So you traded someone who knew you for someone who was impressed by you?" Daniel said, "Yes." Marcus said, "And how did that work out?" Daniel picked up his fork again. He didn't answer because the answer was sitting across both of their minds, already fully formed and requiring no elaboration. That was a Thursday evening. On Friday morning, Daniel received a phone call that changed the trajectory of everything. It came from a woman named Patricia Huang, who ran the most respected women's entrepreneurship organization in the Northeast, and whose opinion in Boston's professional community carried extraordinary weight. Patricia did not call Daniel often. When she did, he paid attention. She said, "Daniel, I'm calling because Emily reached out to me this week about a project she's developing, and I want you to know, because I think you should hear this from someone outside the situation, that what she's building is extraordinary. I've been waiting for something like this for years, and the fact that Emily is the person building it means it's going to work." Daniel said, "What is she building?" Patricia said, "An investment and mentorship network for women entrepreneurs. She's calling it the Carter Initiative. She's using her maiden name. She has 12 committed participants already. She has conversations underway with 4 institutional partners, and she has a board of advisors that includes 3 people whose names you would recognize and be impressed by." She paused. "I'm calling you not to rub your nose in it. I'm calling you because Emily mentioned that the Whitmore Corporation might be in a position to be a founding sponsor, and I thought you should know that if that offer is genuine, you should take it. Not for optics. Because it's genuinely the right thing to do, and because Emily is genuinely the right person to do this, and because some debts are better paid forward than paid back." Daniel sat with that for a full minute after the call ended. Then he called Arthur and told him to set up a meeting with the company's philanthropy committee for the following week. Arthur said, "About what?" Daniel said, "About a founding sponsorship for the Carter Initiative." There was a pause on Arthur's end. Then Arthur said, "I'll set it up this afternoon." The news reached Emily through Patricia, who called her that afternoon with an expression in her voice that Emily recognized as barely contained satisfaction. Patricia said, "Daniel's office called about the sponsorship." Emily said, "I know." Patricia said, "You knew he'd do it." Emily said, "No, but I knew that if he didn't, it didn't matter. We have enough. I just thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought giving him the opportunity to do the right thing was more useful than protecting myself from the possibility that he wouldn't." Patricia said, "Emily Carter, you are a more evolved human being than I will ever be." Emily laughed. It was a real laugh, not the careful, controlled social laugh she had deployed for 12 years at Whitmore events, but the actual one, the one that came from somewhere unguarded and genuine. It felt unfamiliar and completely right at the same time. 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Emily's mother called. Her mother, Catherine Carter, was 67 years old and had been a high school librarian for 31 years and was one of the sharpest people Emily had ever known. She had said very little about the situation with Daniel. Since Emily had called her the morning after the dinner, she had listened, asked 3 precise questions, and said, "Okay, what do you need from me right now?" And Emily had said, "Nothing yet. I'll tell you when that changes." And Catherine had said, "I'll be here." On this Sunday afternoon, Catherine called and said, "I want to drive down and see your apartment." Emily said, "It's very small." Catherine said, "Good. Small means you chose it for yourself and not to impress anyone." She arrived an hour and a half later. She walked through the apartment, the desk, the chair, the coffee maker, and said nothing for a moment. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her daughter and said, "You look different." Emily said, "Different how?" Catherine said, "Like yourself. The way you looked before you got very good at being what other people needed." She paused. "I missed this version of you." Emily sat down across from her mother and said, "Mom, did you know, during the marriage, did you see what was happening?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I saw that you were carrying more than you talked about. I saw that when you talked about Daniel's success, you talked about it the way you used to talk about group projects in school, like something you had built together, but whose name was on someone else's paper." Emily said, "Why didn't you say anything?" Catherine said, "Because you didn't ask, and because you are the kind of person who needs to figure things out through the doing, not through being told. If I had said something 3 years ago, you would have defended him. You needed to get here yourself." She reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. "I'm glad you got here." Emily looked at her mother's hand on hers. She said, "I'm starting something, a fund, a network, for women who need what I had access to but couldn't get." Catherine said, "Tell me about it," Emily told her. All of it. Diane in the coffee shop, the 6 pages of notes, the conversation with Rachel, the 12 committed participants, the institutional conversations, Patricia the sponsorship. She talked for 40 minutes, and her mother listened the way a librarian listens completely without interruption, with the particular quality of attention that makes you feel like what you're saying is being genuinely understood and preserved. When Emily finished, Catherine said, "What do you need to get started practically? What's the one thing that would make the first phase real?" Emily said, "Office space. Somewhere I can meet with the women in the program without having it be a coffee shop or Rachel's conference room." Catherine said, "I know someone. Do you remember your father's colleague, James Whitfield? His daughter Clara runs a co-working space in Cambridge that supports women-owned businesses. I'll call her tomorrow." Emily stared at her mother. "How do you know that?" Catherine smiled and said, "Because I'm a librarian, sweetheart. It's my job to know where to find things." The office space came through by Wednesday, and that Wednesday afternoon was also when Daniel showed up, not at her apartment, not at Rachel's office, at the co-working space in Cambridge where Emily had spent the morning in meetings with 2 of her program participants and the afternoon reviewing partnership documents with Rachel. She was gathering her things to leave when she looked up, and Daniel was standing in the doorway of the small meeting room. He looked tired. Not the tired of someone who hadn't slept, the tired of someone who had been doing difficult internal work for 3 weeks and was still not finished. He said, "Patricia told me you'd found office space. I asked her where. She told me it was up to her." Emily said, "Patricia told you." He said, "Actually, she told me it was none of my business," and then paused long enough that I could read the address off the letterhead on her desk. He paused. "I don't think it was accidental." Emily almost smiled. She said, "What do you want, Daniel?" He came into the room and sat down across from her and put both hands on the table in the way people do when they want to demonstrate that they're not holding anything back. He said, "I want to tell you something, not to ask for anything, not to negotiate, just to say it because I think you deserve to hear it said directly." She waited. He said, "I have spent the last 3 weeks going through everything, the company, the decisions, the restructuring, and the whole time what I kept finding underneath everything was you, your judgment, your relationships, your work. Everywhere I looked, Emily, in every room of that company, there was something you had built or protected or fixed, and your name was on none of it. And I put your name on none of it, deliberately, because having your name on it would have meant sharing the credit, and I was too—" He stopped. "I was too small for that. For a long time I was too small for that." Emily said nothing. He said, "The board approved the sponsorship for the Carter Initiative, full founding sponsorship, 3-year commitment. It's going through legal this week. I want you to know that's not—" He paused. "I'm not doing that to get something back. I'm doing it because it's right and because it's the only concrete thing I can point to and say, this is me acknowledging what I owe." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Daniel, what you just said, that's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 years." His face changed. Something in it shifted, not with relief exactly, but with a kind of pain that was entirely different from the pain of someone protecting their ego. It was the pain of someone who understood finally and completely what they had done. He said, "I know it's too late for that to fix anything." She said, "It doesn't fix anything, but it matters. It matters that you can say it." She stood up and gathered her folder. "The sponsorship will go a long way, Daniel. Not for me personally, for the women in the program. That's where the good from this gets to land, not on us." He nodded. She started for the door, and then she stopped. She turned around. She said, "I had a conversation with Olivia." His expression shifted. He said, "I know. She told me." Emily said, "She's not a bad person. She made bad choices, so did you? So did I for years. But she's not a bad person." Daniel said, "I know." Emily said, "She deserves honesty from you. Whatever happens going forward, she deserves that." He said, "I'm working on it." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Work harder." She walked out of the room. In the hallway, she passed a young woman named Sophia, one of her program participants, 29 years old, running a small sustainable packaging company out of her apartment, brilliant and underfunded, and operating with the particular energy of someone who knows exactly what they're capable of and is simply waiting for someone to give them the tools. Sophia was gathering her things from the reception desk and looked up as Emily passed and said, "Same time Thursday." Emily said, "Same time Thursday, and bring the updated projections. I want to go through the lending structure with you." Sophia's face broke into a smile that was entirely unguarded and genuine, the smile of someone who has spent a long time not being taken seriously and is still slightly amazed by what it feels like when that changes. Emily smiled back. She pushed through the door of the co-working space and stepped out into the Cambridge afternoon air. She had 3 calls to make before 6 o'clock and a document to review before she met Rachel for dinner and a page of notes in her notebook that she wanted to expand before she lost the thread. She was busy. She was building. She was for the first time in a very long time building something with her own name on it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a text from a number she didn't immediately recognize, and then she read the name the contact had saved as, and her breath caught for just a fraction of a second. It was from Victoria Whitmore. Victoria, who had never once in 12 years of marriage texted Emily directly, who communicated through invitations and phone calls and the carefully choreographed machinery of family events, who had said at the charity dinner in the voice of a woman furious at her son, "Daniel, fix this, right now." The text said, "Emily, I owe you an apology that is long overdue. I would like to give it to you in person if you're willing. No agenda, just an old woman admitting she should have spoken up sooner. My garden Saturday morning if you're available. Breakfast." Emily stood on the sidewalk and read the message twice. Then she looked up at the sky for a moment, at the specific quality of afternoon light that comes in October in New England, when the air is clean and cool and everything is in the process of changing. She typed back, "Saturday. I'll be there." She put the phone in her bag and started walking, and in the back of her mind, quietly and without fanfare, something that had been tight for a very long time finally began slowly to release. Part 4. The morning Victoria told the truth. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the way October mornings in New England sometimes do when the season has finally committed to itself and stopped pretending it might turn back. Emily drove to the Whitmore mansion with the particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from having processed so much feeling that you arrive at something cleaner on the other side. She had slept well. She had made her coffee. She had sat at her desk by the window for an hour before she left, the way she did every morning now, and let her own thoughts settle before she brought anyone else's into the day. She did not know exactly what Victoria wanted to say, but she had decided somewhere between reading the text on the Cambridge sidewalk and arriving at Saturday morning that she would listen without armor. Not because Victoria had earned that openness, but because Emily had spent too many years in that family, managing her own reactions so carefully that she had never once simply let herself respond honestly to anything Victoria said or did. And she was done managing reactions that weren't hers to manage. The housekeeper, a woman named Grace, who had worked for Victoria for 19 years and who had always been quietly kind to Emily, in the way that people are kind when they can see something others are choosing not to see, opened the front door before Emily could knock. Grace said, "Mrs. Whitmore is in the garden. She asked me to bring you straight through." Emily followed her through the house. Victoria was sitting at the small iron table near the back of the garden, the one that caught the morning sun, with a pot of coffee and 2 cups and a plate of pastries that Emily recognized as being from the French bakery in Brookline that Victoria only ordered from when she was trying to communicate something through the gesture of the food. She stood when Emily came through the door, and the act of standing Victoria Whitmore, who generally operated from a position of studied stillness, felt significant. She said, "Emily, thank you for coming." Emily sat down across from her. Victoria poured the coffee herself, which she also almost never did, and slid a cup across the table, and then sat back in her chair and looked at Emily with an expression that Emily had never seen on her face before. Not the careful neutrality of social events, not the cool assessment of a woman measuring whether someone was adequate for her family. Something more unguarded than either of those. Victoria said, "I've been trying to write this in my head for 2 weeks. The right words, the right order. I finally decided that looking for the right words was just another way of procrastinating. So I'm going to say the imperfect version, and you can correct me where I'm wrong." Emily said, "All right." Victoria wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "I knew. About Daniel and the way things were in your marriage. Not about Olivia specifically, that was a shock. And I want to be clear that I was genuinely furious with him about that. In a way I have not been furious with him since he was 17 years old, and crashed my car into a parking structure and lied about it for 2 weeks. But the larger pattern, the way he had been treating you, the way he had stopped acknowledging what you contributed, the way you had become background in your own marriage, I saw that. I saw it for at least 4 years, and I said nothing." Emily listened. Victoria said, "I told myself a number of things to justify not saying anything. I told myself it was between the two of you. I told myself that you were a capable woman who didn't need me to intervene. I told myself that all marriages go through difficult periods, and mine certainly did, and I hadn't asked for anyone's intervention during those periods." She paused. "All of those things were true, and none of them were the real reason." Emily said, "What was the real reason?" Victoria looked at her directly. She said, "The real reason was that it was convenient for me, for the family. You were holding things together, Emily, not just the marriage, the company, the relationships, the reputation. And as long as you were holding it together, I didn't have to worry about it. I could trust that whatever Daniel did, you would manage the consequences. And I was grateful for that, in the way that people are grateful for things they don't want to look at too closely, because looking at them closely would require them to do something about it." The garden was very quiet. Emily said, "Victoria, that's a more honest thing than I expected you to say." Victoria said, "I'm 71 years old. I'm running low on time and completely out of patience for dishonesty." She picked up her coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. "I should have spoken to Daniel years ago. I should have told him that what he was doing, taking your contributions and wearing them as his own, was not acceptable. That it was not how his father treated me in our good years. That it was not the kind of man I raised him to be, or the kind I thought I was raising." She stopped. "His father was not a perfect man, but he was a man who knew what he owed the people who stood beside him." Emily said quietly, "What happened between you and Daniel's father, if you're willing to say?" Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "We went through something when Daniel was 11 years old. A business failure. A real one, the kind where you lose almost everything and the people around you find out who they actually are. My husband came very close to losing himself in that. He made choices I didn't agree with. He pulled away from me in the way that men of his generation pulled away from their wives when they were ashamed, not toward someone else, just inward. Gone." She paused. "We had 2 years that were very dark, but we came back from it, because he eventually turned around and told me the truth, all of it. What he'd done, what he'd been afraid of, what he needed from me, that he hadn't been able to ask for. And I told him what I needed, and we rebuilt something that was actually better than what we'd had before." She looked at Emily steadily. "Daniel never saw the dark years. He was too young. He only ever saw the result. He never learned what it cost to get there." Emily said nothing for a moment. She was processing the particular weight of what Victoria had just given her, not just information, but the thing behind the information, the genuine opening up of something that Victoria Whitmore kept extremely private. She said, "I don't know if Daniel and I have what you and his father had. I don't know if we can find our way to something real again. I'm not sure I've decided what I want." Victoria said, "I'm not asking you to decide that. I'm not here to advocate for my son. He's 44 years old, and he needs to advocate for himself." She met Emily's eyes. "I'm here because I owe you an apology that has nothing to do with Daniel. I owe you an apology for watching a woman work herself into the background of her own life and saying nothing. For benefiting from your sacrifice without acknowledging it. For being the kind of mother-in-law who expected more from you than she expected from her own son." Emily felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not tearfully, just a small, specific release like a knot that has been there long enough that you've stopped noticing it until it's gone. She said, "I accept that, Victoria." Victoria reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. Her hand was thin and cool and entirely deliberate in its movement. She said, "The Carter Initiative. Patricia Huang called me about it." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Patricia moves fast." Victoria said, "Patricia moves at exactly the speed she wants to move at, which is generally faster than anyone expects." The corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "I want to be involved. Not as a sponsor, the company is doing that, and that's appropriate. I mean personally. I have relationships in this city that go back 50 years, Emily. Donors, board members, family offices that have known me since before Daniel was born. If you're building something to give women access to rooms they've been kept out of, I know which rooms, and I know the people holding the doors." She paused. "If you'll have me." Emily looked at this woman, this complicated, formidable, sometimes infuriating woman who had been her mother-in-law for 12 years and her observer for all of them, and felt something that surprised her. Respect. Genuine, unforced respect. She said, "I'll have you, but I need you to understand something, Victoria. This isn't a Whitmore project. It's not connected to the family's social agenda. The women in this program didn't get to grow up with access to what your family had, and the whole point is that they don't have to pretend they did. If you're in this, you're in it on those terms," Victoria said without hesitation. "Those are my terms too." Emily believed her. They spent another hour at that table. They talked about the initiative's structure, about specific women Victoria knew who might benefit from the program, about 3 donors. Victoria was confident she could bring to an initial conversation. They talked practically specifically with the efficiency of 2 people who are both, when not performing their respective roles in a family drama, genuinely competent at getting things done. At one point, Emily looked at Victoria across the table and thought, "We could have been doing this for years if things had been different. If he had been different." She didn't say that out loud, but Victoria caught something in her expression because Victoria was sharp in the way that people are sharp when they have paid attention to everything for 7 decades. She said, "Don't grieve the years, use the ones that are left." Emily nodded. She drove back to Cambridge with a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between melancholy and hope, the particular emotional texture of something ending and something beginning in the same breath. She was still sitting with that feeling on Monday morning when the second unexpected thing happened. She was in her Cambridge office reviewing a grant application with Sophia when Rachel called. Rachel never called during working hours unless it was urgent. Emily stepped out of the meeting room and picked up and said, "What happened?" Rachel said, "I just got off the phone with Gerald Forsyth. There's been a development at Whitmore Corporation that you need to know about." Emily said, "Tell me." Rachel said, "One of the junior executives, a man named Clifton Gray, who joined the company about 18 months ago, has been talking to a financial journalist. Background conversations initially. But the journalist has enough now that she's going to publish. The story is about the company's internal governance failures over the past several years. And Emily..." Rachel paused. "Clifton gave her your name, not in a negative context. He told her that you were the person who actually kept the company functional during the period in question, and that you received no credit for it. He gave her specifics, deal names, dates. He had documentation." Emily sat down. She said, "How much does the journalist have?" Rachel said, "Enough to write a substantial piece. She's already reached out to the Whitmore Corporation's press office for comment. And she reached out to me this morning as your attorney to ask if you'd be willing to speak to her." Emily said, "Who is she?" Rachel said, "Her name is Dana Reeves. She writes for the Boston Globe's business section. She's serious, Emily. This isn't a gossip piece. She's writing about governance failures and family-controlled businesses, and you're the central figure in the case study." Emily closed her eyes for a second. She said, "Does Daniel know?" Rachel said, "Gerald told him this morning. I don't know how he reacted." Emily said, "Give me an hour." She went back into the meeting room and told Sophia they'd need to reschedule, and Sophia, who had learned over the past 3 weeks to read Emily's tone very accurately, simply gathered her things and said, "Thursday," and left without asking questions. Emily sat alone in the room for 40 minutes. She thought about Dana Reeves and the Boston Globe, and what a story like that would do to the company, to Daniel, to the restructuring process that was genuinely in progress and genuinely making changes that mattered. She thought about Clifton Gray, whom she knew slightly, a young man who had clearly been paying attention and who had apparently felt strongly enough about what he witnessed to take a significant professional risk in talking to a journalist. She thought about what she actually wanted, not what would protect her, not what would damage Daniel the most, not what would satisfy anyone's sense of justice from the outside, what she actually honestly wanted. She picked up the phone and called Dana Reeves directly. Dana answered on the second ring and said, "Emily Carter, thank you for calling." Emily said, "I want to understand what you're writing before I decide what I'm willing to say." Dana said, "Fair. Can I walk you through it?" She did for 20 minutes. It was serious. It was well-researched. It was, Emily recognized as she listened, going to be published whether Emily spoke to her or not. Clifton Gray had given her enough that the piece could stand without Emily's participation. But without Emily's voice, it would be a story about absence, about a woman who had been erased and never spoke up. With Emily's voice, it could be something different. Emily said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to tell me honestly." Dana said, "Okay." Emily said, "Is this story about destroying a company, or is it about a pattern that happens in a lot of companies?" Dana said, "It's about the pattern. The Whitmore Corporation is the case study because it's well documented and because you're willing to talk. But the argument of the piece is systemic. It's about what happens to women who prop up family businesses from the inside and receive neither credit nor protection when things go wrong. You're not the only one this has happened to. You're just the one where someone was keeping receipts." Emily said, "Clifton Gray kept receipts." Dana said, "Clifton Gray kept very good receipts." Emily thought for another moment. Then she said, "I'll talk to you, but I have conditions." Dana said, "Tell me." Emily said, "The story cannot be framed as revenge. I am not doing this to hurt Daniel or the company. The company has begun a genuine restructuring process. That needs to be in the story. I also want the piece to include information about the Carter Initiative and what it's trying to do, because the constructive response to this pattern matters as much as documenting the pattern itself." Dana said, "I can work with that." Emily said, "One more thing. Clifton Gray took a real risk talking to you. His name in that article exposes him professionally. I want to make sure the piece is written in a way that makes clear his motivation was integrity and not grievance." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Emily, I've interviewed a lot of people over the years. I've talked to people who came to me, angry people who came to me, scared people who came to me with agendas. I had to spend weeks untangling. I don't know exactly what I expected from you, but I want you to know that what you just described, your conditions, they're all about protecting other people, the company, a junior employee, the integrity of the story about your own mistreatment." She paused. "That's remarkable." Emily said, "That's habit. I'm working on making it a choice instead." They arranged to meet on Wednesday. Daniel called that afternoon. He said, "Emily, Gerald told me about the journalist." Emily said, "I know." He said, "Are you going to talk to her?" She said, "Yes." There was a silence. Then he said, "Okay." She waited for more. The protest, the plea, the strategic argument about optics and timing and the impact on the restructuring process. It didn't come. He said, "Is there anything I should know? Anything you need from me before the story runs?" She said, "A statement. From you on record acknowledging what happened. Not a corporate statement from your press office. From you personally in your own words." He said, "I'll write it." She said, "Daniel." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Make it true. Don't make it what you think sounds good. Make it what's actually true." He said quietly, "I will." He sent the statement to Dana Reeves on Tuesday morning. Emily read it on Wednesday before her interview because Dana showed it to her, not as a professional courtesy, but because she said, "You need to see this before we talk." The statement was 1 paragraph long. It said in Daniel's own unpolished words that for the better part of 6 years, he had benefited from his wife's judgment relationships and work without acknowledging or protecting her contributions in any formal way. That this was a failure of his own integrity and not a consequence of anything Emily had done or failed to do. that he was grateful the Whitmore Corporation was undergoing genuine structural change, and that whatever the outcome of that change, the public record should reflect that its survival during its most difficult period was substantially the result of Emily Carter's effort. He had signed it with his full name, no title, no corporate letterhead, just his name. Emily read it twice. She handed it back to Dana and said, "Okay, let's talk." The interview lasted 2 hours. Emily told the truth, all of it, specifically, without exaggeration and without softening. She talked about the guarantees and the lender relationships and the negotiations and the decisions she had made and the credit she had not received. She talked about what it felt like to be essential and invisible simultaneously, in a way that she suspected would resonate with women in family businesses and corporate structures all over the country, because she had come to understand that her situation was not unusual. It was simply unusually well documented. She talked about the Carter Initiative. She talked about Sophia and Diane and the 11 other women in the program and what they were building. She talked about what access actually meant and why it mattered more than capital. At the very end, Dana said, "What do you want people to take from this story?" Emily thought for a moment. Then she said, "I want women who are carrying things no one acknowledges to understand that carrying it in silence doesn't protect the thing. It just protects the people who benefit from it. And I want people who are taking credit for things they didn't build alone to understand that it catches up with you, not as revenge, as reality. Reality always catches up." Dana nodded and wrote that down. The article published on a Thursday 3.5 weeks later. By noon it had been shared 11,000 times. By evening, Emily's phone had 47 messages from people she knew and 30-something from people she didn't, women mostly in similar situations, in similar structures, in similar silences. Some of them were asking for help. Some of them were just saying thank you for saying it out loud. Patricia called and said, "The Carter Initiative just received 14 new inquiries from potential participants in 4 hours." Rachel called and said, "My phone hasn't stopped. I'm going to need to hire someone." Victoria called and said simply, "Well done." Her mother called and said, "I'm very proud of you. How are you feeling?" Emily said, "Honest answer." Catherine said, "Always." Emily said, "Terrified and more alive than I've felt in years." Catherine said, "That's exactly what it feels like when you're doing the right thing." But the call Emily did not expect came at 7:30 that evening, when she was back in her apartment at the desk by the window, reading through the messages and trying to prioritize which ones to respond to first. The call was from Clifton Gray. He said, "Emily, I want to apologize. I didn't consult you before I went to Dana. I should have." Emily said, "Clifton, you documented what you witnessed and you told the truth about it. You don't owe me an apology for that." He said, "I want you to know why I did it. It wasn't. I want to be clear. It wasn't about Daniel specifically. It was about watching you walk out of that elevator after the board meeting. I was there in the lobby, and I watched you come out, and I watched Daniel come out after you, and I heard what you said to him, about 12 years and carrying him and needing to find out who you were without doing either." He stopped. "I have a mother who spent 20 years in a situation like that. Different details, same shape. And nobody ever wrote a statement about what she contributed. Nobody ever told the truth about it publicly. And I thought, if there's ever a situation where someone can make that record exist, this is it." Emily was quiet for a moment. She said, "How is your mother?" He said, "She's good. She started a catering business 6 years ago. It's doing really well." Emily said, "Tell her I'd like to meet her." There was a pause on the other end. Then Clifton said, "She's going to cry when I tell her that." Emily smiled. She said, "That's okay. I've been doing that too sometimes, when nobody's watching." After she hung up, she sat by the window for a long time. The city moved below her traffic lights, the particular steady hum of a place that keeps going regardless of what any individual inside it is going through. She had spent 12 years in a version of her life where she was always managing what was visible, always controlling what the room saw, always absorbing what couldn't be allowed to be seen. She was not doing that tonight. Tonight she was just a woman sitting by a window, thinking about what she had built and what she had lost, and what she was in the process of building now, and letting herself feel the full, complicated weight of all three of those things simultaneously. Her phone buzzed one more time. She looked at the screen. It was Daniel. The message said, "I read the piece, every word. I don't have anything to add to what I already said. I just wanted you to know I read it, and I'm glad you said it." She read the message twice. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and looked out the window at the city. She did not write back, not because she was angry, but because she was in the middle of something that required all of her attention, and that something was entirely her own, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not going to interrupt it for anyone else, not even him, especially not him. She picked up her notebook and opened it to a fresh page and started writing. Part 5. The Woman Who Chose Herself. The article changed things in ways Emily had not fully anticipated. She had expected professional attention. She had expected the initiative inquiries, the phone calls, the messages from women in similar situations who had been waiting for someone to say publicly what they had only been saying privately in the dark to themselves. She had prepared herself for that, at least conceptually. What she had not prepared herself for was the particular quality of attention that came from people who had known her for years, colleagues, acquaintances, people she had sat next to at Whitmore Corporation events and charity dinners and industry conferences, calling not to discuss the article but to apologize. Not dramatically, just quietly, one by one. A former board associate named James, who said, "Emily, I watched you handle the Meridian situation, and I thought she's extraordinary. And then I walked into the next room and congratulated Daniel. I've thought about that since the article ran, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry." A woman named Claire, who had been on the charity gala committee with Emily for 3 years, and who called to say, "I think I knew. I think a lot of us knew, and we looked away because it was easier. That's not an excuse. I just wanted to say it to your face." Each call cost her something and gave her something at the same time. She took every one of them. By the end of the second week after the article published, the Carter Initiative had received 63 applications from women seeking to join the program. Emily and Rachel had anticipated 20 by the end of the first year. They sat across from each other in the Cambridge office on a Tuesday morning with the application files spread across the table between them and looked at each other with the expression of people who have built something larger than their original blueprint. Rachel said, "We need more staff." Emily said, "We need a bigger office first." Rachel said, "Clara's building has 2 more units." Emily said, "Call her this afternoon." Rachel said, "Already did. She's holding them." Emily looked at her for a moment and said, "Rachel, what would I do without you?" Rachel said, without looking up from the files, "You'd do exactly what you're doing now, just more slowly and with worse coffee." It was the right answer, and they both knew it, and it made Emily laugh the way she had been laughing more frequently lately, openly, without calculation, with the particular freedom of someone who has stopped monitoring how she sounds. Sophia presented her first full financial projections that week. She came into the office on Thursday morning with a spiral-bound document and a focused expression and sat down across from Emily and said, "I want you to be honest with me. If you see problems, tell me." Emily read through it carefully. She asked questions, real ones, not softening questions, but precise, challenging questions about assumptions and timelines and contingency planning. Sophia answered most of them. On 2, she said, "I don't know, I need to think about that." And Emily said, "Good. That's the right answer. Come back when you've thought about it." When Sophia left, she stopped in the doorway and turned around and said, "Can I tell you something?" Emily said, "Yes." Sophia said, "When I first came to this program, I thought I don't know exactly what I thought. I thought I needed someone to give me money or connections or some kind of permission. But what you actually gave me was, you treated my ideas like they were serious before I knew if they were serious. And that changed how I thought about them." She paused. "I don't think I would have written that projection document if someone hadn't looked at me first like my ideas were worth writing down." Emily looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Sophia, your ideas were always worth writing down. You just needed a room where that was the assumption." Sophia nodded and left. Emily sat with that for a while, because that was exactly it. That was the whole thing, not the capital, not the connections, not even the specific knowledge she was transferring. The assumption. The foundational prior assumption that the person across the table was serious and capable and worth the full weight of your attention. She had spent 12 years in rooms where that assumption was constantly being withheld from her, and she had spent so long working to prove herself worthy of it that she had forgotten it was supposed to be the starting point, not the reward. She opened her notebook and wrote that down. It would become 3 months later the opening paragraph of the Carter Initiative's founding statement. The divorce proceedings began formally in November. Rachel managed everything on Emily's side with the precision and care that Emily had expected, and the additional quality of genuine protectiveness that she had not always known Rachel was capable of expressing so openly. Rachel was not simply her attorney. She was, Emily understood now, one of the most important people in her life, someone who had seen her clearly and consistently for 15 years and had never once asked her to be smaller. The proceedings were not combative. That surprised some people, and Emily could see the surprise when she mentioned it, the slight adjustment of expectation in people's expressions, the recalibration. They had expected a fight. They had expected the kind of high-stakes matrimonial battle that Boston's legal community generated periodically, the kind with depositions and counterclaims, and dueling financial experts, and 2 years of compounding acrimony. Instead, Daniel did something that Emily had not predicted. He signed everything Rachel proposed without negotiation, not because his own attorney advised him to. In fact, his attorney, a sharp man named Garrett, who had been handling Whitmore family legal matters for a decade, called Rachel twice to confirm that Daniel understood what he was agreeing to. Rachel confirmed it both times. Garrett called Daniel directly and said apparently, "Daniel, you understand she's getting the full valuation on the Carter Initiative's founding assets, plus the personal guarantee compensation structure that Emily proposed." And Daniel had said yes. Garrett said, "And you understand that's substantially more than you would likely be required to." Daniel said, "I know what I'm required to do. I know what I should do. Sign it." Rachel told Emily this the morning the paperwork was finalized, and Emily listened and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That doesn't change anything." Rachel said, "I know, but I thought you should know he did it." Emily said, "It means he understands what happened. It doesn't mean it didn't happen." Rachel said, "No, it doesn't." Emily said, "Okay, what's next?" And they moved forward. December arrived, and with it the particular compressed energy of year-end in Boston, everything happening at once, every organization trying to close out their calendar before the holidays arrived, and took everyone's attention with them. Emily was in 3 meetings a day, sometimes 4. She was reviewing applications, meeting with institutional partners, finalizing the governance structure of the initiative with a small board she had assembled with care. Patricia Huang Victoria Whitmore, a woman named Dr. Anita Reyes, who ran a community development organization in Roxbury and whose ground-level understanding of what women in underserved communities actually needed was something Emily had come to consider essential, and 2 women from the first cohort of the program who had agreed to serve in an advisory capacity. She had also quietly been in contact with 3 other cities: Chicago, where a colleague of Patricia's ran a similar but smaller organization and was looking for a partner; Atlanta, where a woman Emily had met at a conference in October, had followed up twice with genuine interest in replicating the model; Seattle, where Clara's counterpart ran a co-working space that had been trying to launch a mentorship component for 2 years without the right structure. The Carter Initiative was not going to stay in Boston. Emily had not announced this yet because she wanted the Boston program to be genuinely solid before she expanded its footprint. But she knew. She had known since the 63 applications came in. The shape of what she was building was larger than she had originally drawn it. She told her mother on a Sunday phone call in early December. Catherine said, "Chicago, Atlanta, Seattle." Emily said, "Potentially, if the infrastructure supports it." Catherine said, "It will support it. You'll make sure it does." Emily said, "Mom, I don't want to get ahead of myself." Catherine said, "Emily Ann Carter, you have spent your entire professional life making other people's overreach sustainable. You are allowed to let your own vision run a little ahead of your current capacity and trust that you'll catch up. You always do." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what the strangest thing is? I'm happy. I'm actually not managed happiness, not making the best of it happiness. I'm genuinely happy, and I keep waiting for something to disrupt it." Catherine said, "That's what it feels like when you've been in survival mode for so long that peace feels suspicious. Give it time. It'll start to feel normal." It was good advice. Emily filed it away. The disruption when it came was not what she expected. It came in the form of a phone call from Gerald Forsyth on a Wednesday morning in mid-December, and his voice had the quality it had at the board meeting 4 months ago, careful, measured, carrying something that was trying not to sound as significant as it was. He said, "Emily, something has come to the board's attention that I think you should hear directly from me." She said, "Tell me." He said, "We've been approached by a private equity firm about a potential acquisition of the Whitmore Corporation. The approach is serious. The valuation is significant. And one of the conditions the firm has put forward is that they want an experienced operational leader involved in any transition structure." He paused. "They asked specifically about you, by name." Emily set down her coffee cup. She said, "Which firm?" He said, "Hargrove Capital. They've been watching the restructuring. They said, and I'm quoting their managing partner directly here, they said the only reason they believe the restructuring is real is because the person who made the original company function is still involved in its recovery." Emily said, "I'm not involved in the recovery. I withdrew my guarantees. I've been advising from the outside." Gerald said, "I know. They know that too. They said that's exactly why they believe it, because a person who was just protecting their interests would have stayed closer. The fact that you stepped back and still helped rebuild it tells them something about your character that they find—" He searched for the word compelling. Emily was quiet. Gerald said, "There's no obligation here, Emily. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that your work is being seen, correctly and by people with significant resources. Whatever you decide to do with that information is entirely up to you." After she hung up, she sat very still at her desk for several minutes. She was not tempted by the acquisition opportunity in the way Gerald might have expected. She was not turning over the possibilities of re-engaging with the Whitmore Corporation in a formal capacity. That was not the life she was building. But something about the call settled into her differently. Something about the phrase they said. The only reason they believe the restructuring is real is because of her. After years of being the person whose contributions were explained away, minimized, absorbed into someone else's narrative, there was something disorienting and clarifying at the same time about being seen so specifically by people who had no reason to flatter her. She called Daniel. Not because she owed him the information, but because he was still the CEO of that company at least until any acquisition changed that, and she had decided months ago that she was going to stop managing her behavior based on what was protective and start operating based on what was honest. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Gerald called me about Hargrove Capital." He said, "I know. I asked him to call you." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you built half of what they're valuing. You deserve to hear it from someone, and I thought it would mean more from Gerald than from me right now." A pause. "I'm trying to figure out how to do the right thing even when it doesn't benefit me directly. I'm told that's how it's supposed to work." She said, "Who told you that?" He said, "My mother," repeatedly, with a specificity that suggested she had been waiting a long time to say it. Emily almost smiled. She said, "Daniel, what are you going to do about the acquisition?" He said, "I don't know yet. Garrett thinks I should engage seriously. Arthur thinks the timing is right. My mother thinks I should figure out who I am without the company before I decide whether to sell it." He paused. "What do you think?" Emily said. "I think your mother is right." He said, "She usually is. It's deeply inconvenient." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, the first silence between them in months that didn't carry the weight of everything unresolved. Then he said, "Emily, can I ask you something? And I want you to know before I ask it that I'm not asking because I expect anything. I'm asking because I think I need to say it out loud." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "Do you think is there any version of the future where you and I—" She said, "Daniel." He stopped. She said, "I think you have become someone who is asking the right questions. I think the past 4 months have changed you in ways that are real and not performed. I believe that. I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because I've been watching carefully and I know the difference." She stopped. "But I am also someone who spent 6 years carrying you without you noticing, and then 1 year rebuilding myself from the ground up. And what I've built is mine. It fits me in a way that nothing has in a very long time, and I'm not ready to risk that for a maybe, even a real maybe." I was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's fair." She said, "It's not about fair, it's about what's true." He said, "Yeah, I know." She said, "Figure out who you are without the company. Your mother's right. And then figure out who you want to be. Not for me, for yourself. Because the version of you that might deserve a real future with someone is the version that doesn't need someone else carrying him to get there." He said quietly, "I'm working on it." She said, "I know." She ended the call and sat by the window and felt the truth of what she had just said settle into her completely. She was not closing a door out of anger. She was not protecting herself out of fear. She was simply telling the honest truth about where she was and what she was building and what she needed in order to keep building it. It was possibly the cleanest thing she had ever said to him. The award notification arrived in January. Patricia called her on a Tuesday morning, barely containing the particular energy she deployed when she had excellent news she had been sitting on too long. She said, "The Boston Business Women's Foundation has selected you as their annual Leadership Award recipient. The ceremony is in March, in New York." Emily said, "Patricia." Patricia said, "I may have written a nomination letter. I may have asked Victoria and Dr. Reyes and Dana Reeves to write supporting letters. I may have also asked Sophia and 2 other participants in the program to write personal statements." She paused. "I am not sorry." Emily said, "You organized a campaign." Patricia said, "I organized a recognition of something that was long overdue. There's a difference." Emily said, "Is there?" Patricia said, "Yes. A campaign is about politics. This is about accuracy." Emily accepted. She spent the weeks between January and March moving at the speed she had been moving since the initiative launched, which was fast and deliberate and entirely purposeful. Chicago was confirmed. The Atlanta conversation had evolved into a genuine planning partnership. Seattle was 2 months behind the others, but moving. The Boston program had graduated its first cohort, 12 women, 12 businesses, 12 plans that were real and funded, and moving forward with the particular momentum that comes from having been taken seriously at the beginning. Sophia's sustainable packaging company had secured its first commercial contract. It was with a mid-sized grocery chain that served the Boston metro area, and when Sophia called Emily to tell her, her voice was shaking in the way that voices shake when something you built with your own hands becomes undeniably, verifiably real. She said, "I need you to know that this didn't happen because of money. It happened because someone sat across from me and asked hard questions and made me answer them for real. That's what changed everything." Emily said, "You answered them. That's what changed everything." Sophia said, "We both know it's not that simple." Emily said, "No, but it's also not as complicated as giving one person all the credit. That's a habit I'm trying to break." They both laughed. The night before the award ceremony, Emily was in her hotel room in New York when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find her mother, who was supposed to be arriving the following morning. Catherine said, "I took an earlier train." Emily said, "Mom, it's 9:30. Catherine said, "I know. I brought good wine, and I want to sit with my daughter the night before she receives an award without an agenda or a schedule. Is that allowed?" Emily stepped back from the door. Catherine came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her daughter. Really looked at her the way she had been looking at Emily for her entire life, with that librarian's quality of complete and unconditional attention. She said, "You look like yourself." Emily said, "You said that once before, 3 months ago." Catherine said, "It was true then too, but it's more true now. It's settled in." Emily sat across from her mother and accepted the glass of wine Catherine poured and said, "I'm nervous." Catherine said, "About what?" "The speech." Emily said, "About all of it. About what it means to stand up on a stage and have people look at you as someone who has it figured out, when most of the time I still feel like someone who is figuring it out." Catherine said, "Emily, the people who have it figured out are the ones who never admit they don't. The people who are actually doing the work are the ones who are still asking questions." She paused. "You have never stopped asking questions. That's not vulnerability. That's your greatest strength." Emily said, "Daniel said something similar once, early on." Catherine said, "He wasn't wrong about everything." Emily looked at her mother. "No, he wasn't." She thought about Daniel for a moment, not with longing, not with anger, but with the particular equanimity that had replaced both of those things. She thought about what he had said on the phone in December, about figuring out who he was without the company. She had heard through Gerald indirectly that he had engaged a leadership coach, that he had reduced his public profile deliberately, that he had declined 2 speaking invitations and a profile interview that he would previously have accepted without hesitation. Small signals, real ones. She hoped it held, not for her, genuinely for him, because the man she had loved early on had actually been worth loving, and the question of whether that man could find his way back to himself without her carrying him, without her managing him on entirely his own terms, was one she was willing to hold without needing to know the answer. The ceremony the next evening was not what Emily expected. She had expected formal. She had expected the kind of event that felt important primarily to the people inside it and would be forgotten by the people outside it within a week. She had attended many such events. She knew their rhythm. But when she walked into the room and saw who was there, something shifted. Sophia was there in a dress that was clearly new with her partner and her mother, and a slightly dazed expression that said she was still absorbing the reality of being in this room as a guest rather than an outsider. Diane from the coffee shop was there, the one whose floral design business had started everything. Clifton Gray was there looking uncomfortable in a way that was entirely genuine. Rachel was there, and Patricia and Victoria Whitmore, who had driven to New York without mentioning it to anyone and who was sitting in the fourth row, wearing something simple and dark, and looking at the stage with an expression that was entirely unguarded. Dr. Reyes was there, Clara from the co-working space, Dana Reeves from the Globe, 3 women from the Chicago Partnership, 2 from Atlanta, and her mother in the front row with a look on her face that Emily recognized from childhood, the specific look Catherine Carter used when she was feeling something too large for her face to fully contain and was simply letting it be there without trying to manage it. Emily stood at the podium and looked out at the room. She did not use the speech she had written. She folded it, placed it on the podium, and put both hands on either side of it, and looked at the people in front of her and said, "I spent 12 years being very good at carrying things other people needed carried. I was so good at it that I disappeared inside it, not all at once, slowly, the way the light changes so gradually at dusk that you don't notice you're in the dark until you can't see anymore." She paused. "A year ago, someone publicly humiliated me in front of 60 people. And instead of fighting back or falling apart, I walked out. Not because I was strong, because I was finally too tired to pretend that what was happening wasn't happening." The room was completely still. She said, "What I did not know when I walked out that door was that I was walking towards something. I thought I was walking away. But everything I had been building quietly, invisibly, inside someone else's structure, the knowledge, the relationships, the understanding of how things actually work, all of it came with me. It was mine. It had always been mine. I just needed to stop standing in someone else's building long enough to find out." She looked at Sophia, who was looking back at her with an expression that was entirely open. She said, "The Carter Initiative exists because I understand what it feels like to be capable and invisible simultaneously. To do the work and watch someone else take the bow. To know your own value in your bones and still need someone to look at you like you're worth taking seriously before you can fully believe it yourself." She paused. "The women in this program have that capability, every single one of them. They don't need to be made capable. They need to be placed in rooms where capability is the assumption, not the exception. That's the whole program. That's everything." She looked at her mother. Catherine was not trying to contain her expression anymore. She had given up on that. She was just sitting in the front row of a room in New York City, letting herself feel what she felt about her daughter completely and without management, and it was the most beautiful thing Emily had ever seen. She said, "My mother told me once a long time ago that the strongest thing you can be is exactly what you are, not what someone needs you to be, not what a situation requires of you, what you actually are when nobody's watching, when there's no performance and no management and no quiet carrying of things you were never asked to carry." She let that settle. "I am still learning how to do that, but I'm learning it in a room of my own, on a foundation I built myself, and I'm finally done apologizing for how long it took me to get here." The applause was immediate and sustained in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Afterward, in the hallway, Sophia found her first. She said, "That was the truest thing I have ever heard anyone say in public." Emily said, "I'm glad it landed." Sophia said, "It didn't just land. I think I'm going to carry that forever. The part about capability being the assumption, not the exception. That's what you did for me. That's what this whole thing is." Victoria found her next. She put both hands on Emily's arms and looked at her and said, "Your father-in-law would have admired you. I want you to know that." Emily said, "Thank you, Victoria." Victoria said, "No, thank you, for showing an old woman what it looks like to build something without asking anyone's permission." She held Emily's arms for another moment, and then let go and walked back into the room with the posture of a woman who has made peace with something she has been carrying for a long time. Rachel appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of water and said, "Chicago called while you were speaking. They want to accelerate the timeline. And Dana wants a follow-up piece. And Patricia is already working the room." She paused. "Also, your mother is crying and pretending she isn't." Emily said, "She knows I can see her." Rachel said, "She's a librarian. She processes things thoroughly." Emily laughed. She took the water and drank it and looked around the room at all the people who were there because of something she had built and felt the full weight of it without flinching. The weight of something real. The weight of something that was entirely and undeniably hers. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in September, Emily sat at the desk by the window in her Cambridge office, a larger one now with room for a team and a proper conference table and a wall of windows that caught the morning light the way she had always liked light to come in. She had her coffee, she had her notebook, she had 45 minutes before her first meeting. She opened the notebook and looked at what she had written at the top of the most recent page the night before. It said, "Love is not proven by how much pain someone can tolerate. Love is proven by how much respect 2 people can give each other." She had said that to Daniel a long time ago, in what felt now like a different life. She had meant it as the summary of everything she had finally understood about what they had been. But sitting here now in the September light, she understood that it applied to more than marriage. It applied to every room she had ever been in, every structure she had built or maintained or quietly held together while someone else put their name on the door. Every year she had spent making herself smaller to make someone else feel larger. Respect was the word, not admiration, not gratitude, though gratitude mattered. Respect. The foundational structural prior assumption that the person across from you is fully capable and fully present and fully worth taking seriously. She had not always received it. She was building the rooms now where it was the rule. She picked up her pen, and underneath what she had written the night before, she added one more line. She wrote, "I am done being the person no one sees. I am exactly what I built myself to be." She closed the notebook. She picked up her coffee. And Emily Carter, who had once walked out of a room to save herself and ended up building something large enough to change the lives of women she would never stop being grateful to know, turned toward the morning. Not toward anyone else's future. Her own. Entirely, finally, irrevocably her own.